Our mama died this morning. We got nowhere to go. Those 9 words, spoken by a child barely old enough to understand death, would shatter a man who'd spent 5 years running from his own grief. When Thomas Hale found 2 frozen girls in his barn on the coldest night of 1887, he had every reason to turn away. He'd lost everything once before. Opening his door meant risking it all again. But sometimes the things that break us are the same things that make us whole. This is the story of how 3 broken souls became a family, and how a town learned that home isn't where you're born. It's where someone refuses to let you go. If you're watching from your corner of the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now, let me take you back to that winter night when everything changed. The wind came down from the mountains like something alive and angry, carrying snow that cut exposed skin and turned breath to ice before it left your lungs. It was the kind of cold that killed quietly, the kind settlers in Montana Territory had learned to fear more than wolves or wildcats, or any living thing that walked the earth. Clara Brennan knew about that kind of cold. She'd felt it seeping through her mother's quilt 3 nights running, felt it in the stillness of their one-room shack when the fire died to embers and Mama's coughing finally stopped. She'd felt it this morning when she'd touched her mother's face and found it already hard, already belonging more to the winter than to the world of warm things. She was 9 years old, and she understood exactly what death meant. Her sister Elise didn't. Not really. Elise was 7, small for her age, with their mother's dark hair and their father's wide eyes, a father neither of them remembered, a father who'd left when Elise was still in the cradle and Clara barely old enough to form memories that stuck. "Is Mama sleeping?" Elise had asked that morning, her voice small in the gray light filtering through gaps in the wooden walls. Clara had pulled the quilt up over their mother's face, hiding the stillness, hiding the blue tinge around her lips. "Yeah," she'd lied, because what else could she say? "She's sleeping." But Elise wasn't stupid. She'd watched their mother fade over the past month, watched the fever burn through her like a slow fire, watched the coughing fits that brought up blood and left Mama gasping against the thin mattress they all shared. She'd seen the way Mama's eyes had stopped focusing yesterday, how she'd called Clara by her own sister's name, Aunt Ruth, who'd died before either of them were born. "She's not waking up, is she?" Elise whispered. Clara had held her sister close, both of them shivering under the single blanket they had left. The other blankets had been sold weeks ago, along with Mama's wedding ring, the iron skillet, the tin dishes, everything that might bring a few coins to buy bread or cornmeal, or another day of not starving. "No," Clara said, because Elise deserved the truth. "She's not." They'd stayed in the shack until midday, neither of them knowing what to do. Clara knew they should tell someone, the neighbors maybe, or the preacher in town, somebody who'd know about burying and what came after. But the nearest neighbor was old Mrs. Hutchins, 2 miles down the valley, and she'd turned them away last week when Mama sent Clara begging for food. "I got my own troubles," Mrs. Hutchins had said, not unkindly but firm enough that Clara knew not to ask again. "Your Mama should have thought about that before she went and got herself in this condition." As if being poor was something Mama had chosen. As if dying was a decision she'd made that morning over breakfast they didn't have. The preacher, Reverend Michaels, lived in town. Greystone, population maybe 200 if you counted the prospectors who drifted through on their way to the played-out mines up north. It was a 5-mile walk in good weather, and this wasn't good weather. This was the kind of weather that had kept them trapped for 3 days while Mama's breathing got shallower and shallower and finally stopped altogether. Claire had stood at the window, watching snow pile against the door, and made a decision that felt too big for someone her age, but unavoidable just the same. "We have to go," she'd told Elise. "Where?" Clara didn't have an answer. Town, maybe. Somewhere with people. Somewhere that wasn't this shack with Mama's body getting colder and no food and no firewood and night coming on. Just go. They'd wrapped themselves in everything they owned, dresses layered over dresses, Mama's shawl that still smelled like lavender soap from better days, stockings that had more holes than fabric, shoes that Clara had outgrown last summer, and Elise had never quite grown into. Clara had looked one last time at the quilt-covered shape on the bed, had thought about saying goodbye, had thought about praying, had thought about a lot of things that seemed pointless in the face of the simple fact that Mama was dead and they were alive, and staying here meant being dead too, eventually. She'd taken Elise's hand and walked out into the snow. The first mile wasn't so bad. The road, really just wagon ruts frozen into the ground, ran along the valley floor, and the wind wasn't as fierce down low. Clara kept them moving, kept Elise talking about anything and everything to keep her mind off the cold and the empty feeling that was more than just hunger. "Remember when Mama made that apple cake?" Elise said, her breath coming in white puffs. "For your birthday last year?" Claire remembered. Mama had traded sewing work for apples and sugar, had spent a whole afternoon baking in their tiny stove, had presented the cake with such pride you'd have thought it was something from a fancy restaurant instead of a lopsided thing that was burnt on one side and gooey in the middle. "It was the best cake ever," Clara said, even though it wasn't, even though what made it special was the trying, the love baked into every imperfect bite. "Do you think," Elise started, then stopped. "What?" "Do you think she knew that she was going to, that we'd be—" "I don't know," Clara said, which was true. Mama had been clear-minded at the end, or clear enough. She'd held Clara's hand the night before she died, had looked at her with eyes that seemed to see everything and nothing at once. "You're going to have to be strong," Mama had whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rattling the walls. "Stronger than you should have to be. You're going to have to take care of your sister." "You're going to get better," Clara had insisted, desperate and young enough to believe that wanting something badly enough could make it true. But Mama had just shaken her head, had squeezed Clara's hand with what little strength she had left. "Promise me. Promise me you'll look after Elise. Promise me you won't let them separate you." "Who would separate us?" Mama's eyes had drifted closed. "People think they know what's best. They'll want to put you in different homes, different families. Don't let them. You stay together no matter what. You're sisters. That means something." Clara had promised, had meant it with everything in her 9-year-old heart. Now, walking through snow that was up to Elise's knees in places, she wondered how she was supposed to keep that promise when she didn't even know where they were going. The second mile was harder. The road started climbing out of the valley, switchbacking up the ridge, and the wind hit them full force. Snow wasn't falling so much as flying sideways, stinging any exposed skin, finding its way into every gap in their inadequate clothing. Elise started falling behind, her small legs struggling with the depth and the incline. "I'm tired," she whimpered. "I know, just a little further. Where are we going?" "Town. We're going to town." "What's in town?" Clara didn't know. Help, maybe. Someone who'd take pity on 2 orphaned girls. Someone who'd give them food and warmth and a place to sleep that wasn't a frozen shack with their dead mother. Or maybe nothing. Maybe town would be just like Mrs. Hutchins. Sorry for their trouble, but not sorry enough to actually help. Not when everyone was struggling. Not when winter was long and supplies were short and 2 more mouths to feed was 2 mouths too many. By the 3rd mile, Clara was carrying Elise on her back. The smaller girl had simply stopped walking, had stood shivering in the middle of the road with tears freezing on her cheeks. And Clara had known that if she didn't do something, they'd both freeze right there. "Hold on tight," she'd said, crouching down so Elise could climb on. Elise weighed almost nothing, too little really, after weeks of quarter rations and then no rations at all. But after half a mile, Clara's legs were shaking and her back was screaming, and she knew she couldn't carry her sister all the way to town. It was still 2 miles away, maybe more, and the light was starting to fade from the sky, turning the world from white to gray to something darker. Night was coming. The temperature was dropping. And Clara, who'd been trying so hard to be strong, to be what Mama needed her to be, felt the first real fingers of panic closing around her heart. They weren't going to make it to town. The realization came with a clarity that was almost peaceful. They weren't going to make it. They were going to freeze to death on this road. And in the spring, someone would find 2 small bodies huddled together in the snow. And maybe someone would say a prayer, and maybe someone would wonder who they'd been and why no one had helped them. But then Clara saw it. A building, set back from the road maybe 100 yards, barely visible through the blowing snow. Not a house, too big for that, but a barn, solid and dark against the white landscape. "Come on," she gasped, staggering off the road and toward the structure. "Almost there." "Where?" Elise mumbled against her shoulder. "Somewhere warm, somewhere safe." It was a lie, or at least an exaggeration. A barn wasn't warm, not really, not in this weather, but it was shelter from the wind, and shelter was more than they had now. The barn door was closed but not locked. Clara managed to get it open with one hand while holding Elise with the other, and they stumbled into darkness that smelled of hay and animals and old wood. Somewhere in the shadows, a horse whinnied softly, startled by the intrusion. "Shh," Clara whispered, to the horse, to Elise, to herself. "It's okay." They made their way toward the back of the barn, where Clara could make out a pile of hay bales stacked against the wall. She set Elise down carefully, then started pulling hay down to make a nest, a hollow where they could burrow in and trap what little warmth their bodies still produced. "Are we allowed to be here?" Elise asked, her voice small and scared. Clara didn't answer right away. She pulled her sister into the hay nest, wrapped Mama's shawl around both of them, held Elise close, and felt the shivering that racked them both. "I don't know," she finally admitted, "but we didn't have anywhere else to go. What if whoever owns this barn finds us? Then we'll explain. We'll tell them about Mama. We'll ask for help. What if they say no?" Clara closed her eyes. What if they said no? What if they were angry about the trespassing, about the disruption, about two filthy orphan girls hiding in their barn like criminals? What if they sent them back out into the snow, into the night that was falling fast now, into the cold that was already seeping through the hay and their clothes, and the shawl that wasn't enough, had never been enough? "They won't," Clara said, making herself believe it because the alternative was unthinkable. "People are good. They'll help us." Elise pressed closer, and Clara held her, and they sat in the darkness listening to the wind howl around the barn walls and the soft sounds of the animals in their stalls and their own breathing, which seemed too loud, too obvious, too much of a betrayal of their presence. Clara didn't mean to fall asleep. She meant to stay awake, to keep watch, to be ready if someone came. But exhaustion was its own kind of enemy, harder to fight than cold or hunger or fear, and at some point, despite everything, her eyes closed, and she drifted into a sleep that was more like drowning than rest. She dreamed of Mama, not sick Mama, not dying Mama, but Mama from before, from when Papa was still around and they'd had a real house in a real town, and life had been normal in all the ways that mattered. In the dream, Mama was singing, some old lullaby Clara had forgotten she even knew, and the sound of it was so sweet and so sad that even sleeping, Clara felt tears on her cheeks. When she woke, it was to the sound of footsteps. Heavy footsteps, boot heels on the wooden floor of the barn, coming closer. Clara's eyes snapped open, her heart immediately hammering. The barn was dark except for a lantern's glow, moving through the shadows, held by someone tall and broad-shouldered, someone who was walking directly toward their hay bale hiding place. She tried to make herself smaller, tried to will Elise to stillness, but it was too late. The lantern light fell across them, and Clara found herself looking up into the face of a stranger. He was old, or at least he seemed old to Clara's 9-year-old eyes, though he was probably only in his 30s, maybe 40 at most. His face was weathered and hard, with lines around the eyes and mouth that spoke of hard living and harder thoughts. He wore a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, and he was staring down at them with an expression Clara couldn't read. Not angry exactly, but not welcoming either, just flat, empty. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough and low. Clara struggled to her feet, putting herself between the man and Elise, who was still mostly asleep. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, the words tumbling out. "I'm sorry, we didn't mean to trespass. We needed somewhere to get out of the cold, and we didn't think—" "I asked who you are, not why you're here." Clara swallowed hard. "I'm Clara Brennan. This is my sister, Elise. We're from down the valley, the shack near Willow Creek." "I know that shack, the Brennan place. Your mother's Catherine Brennan." "Yes, sir." "Where is she?" The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Clara felt Elise stirring behind her, felt her sister's small hand grabbing the back of her dress, holding on. Clara's voice cracked. She tried again. "Our mama died this morning. We got nowhere to go." The man didn't react, didn't express sympathy or shock or anything at all. He just stood there, holding the lantern, looking at them with those flat, empty eyes. "You got family?" he finally asked. "No, sir." "Friends?" Someone who'd take you in? No, sir. Town's that way, he said, jerking his head toward the direction they'd been traveling. About 4 miles. There's a preacher, Reverend named Michaels. He'll know what to do with you. Clara felt something break inside her chest. He was going to send them away, back out into the cold, into the night, 4 more miles to a town they might not reach before they froze. Please, she heard herself say, and she hated how small her voice sounded, how desperate. Please, we can't. It's too far, and it's too cold, and Elise, she's only 7. She can't. That's not my problem. The words were like a slap. Clara felt Elise start to cry behind her, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle against Clara's back. I understand, Clara said, even though she didn't, even though all she understood was that they were going to die and this man didn't care. I'm sorry we bothered you. We'll go. She turned to help Elise up, her hands shaking, her mind already trying to calculate if they had any chance at all, if maybe they could make it just a little further down the road before… Wait! Clara froze. The man was still standing there, but something had shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but something less hard, less certain. When did she die? Your mother? This morning, just after sunrise, I think. And you've been walking since then? Yes, sir. In this weather? We didn't know what else to do. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Clara heard the wind screaming around the barn, heard the tick of sleet against the walls, heard the sound of a storm that was only getting worse. Finally, the man sighed, a heavy sound, full of something that might have been resignation or regret or just exhaustion. Come on, he said, turning toward the barn door. Clara didn't move. Where? To the house. You can't stay out here all night. You'll freeze. But you said… I know what I said. He looked back at them, and in the lantern light, Clara thought she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not kindness exactly, but maybe the memory of what kindness looked like. I'm saying something different now. You coming or not? Clara grabbed Elise's hand and followed. The house was small, just 3 rooms from what Clara could see. A main room with a fireplace and a table and not much else. A bedroom visible through a half-open door and what might have been a kitchen in the back. It was clean but sparse, the kind of place that spoke of someone living alone and not caring much about comfort or decoration. The man, he still hadn't told them his name, directed them toward the fireplace, where a fire was burning low. He added wood without speaking, building up the flames until heat started radiating into the room. Sit, he said, pointing to a bench near the hearth. They sat. Clara kept Elise close, kept Mama's shawl wrapped around both of them, even though the room was warming, kept her eyes on the man as he moved around the space. He brought them blankets, real blankets, thick and heavy, and nothing like the threadbare thing they'd been sharing. He brought them water in tin cups, and they drank it so fast it hurt going down their throats. When did you eat last? He asked. Clara had to think about it. Yesterday? The day before? Time had gotten strange in those last days with Mama, everything blurring together into one long stretch of cold and hunger and waiting. I don't remember, she finally admitted. The man went to the kitchen. Clara heard him moving around, heard the clink of dishes, the sound of something being cut. When he came back, he was carrying a plate with bread and cheese on it, not much, but more food than Clara had seen in weeks. Eat slowly, he said, setting the plate down on the bench between them. You make yourself sick eating too fast on an empty stomach. Clara wanted to devour everything, wanted to stuff the bread and cheese into her mouth until there was nothing left, but she forced herself to take small bites, made Elise do the same. The bread was slightly stale, the cheese hard, but it was the best thing Clara had ever tasted. The man watched them eat, then turned away and stood by the fire, staring into the flames. My name's Thomas, he said without looking at them. Thomas Hale. This is my place. The barn, the house, the land. About 200 acres, most of it worthless except for grazing. Clara swallowed a mouthful of bread. Thank you for helping us, Mr. Hale. I haven't decided if I'm helping you or not. The word should have been frightening, but Clara was too tired and too warm and too full of bread and cheese to be frightened. Yes, sir. Thomas turned to look at them. Tell me about your mother. So Clara did. She told him about Mama getting sick, about the fever and the coughing and the way she'd gotten weaker and weaker until she couldn't even sit up anymore. She told him about selling everything they had, about the neighbors who'd turned them away, about the morning she'd woken up and known, just known, that Mama wasn't coming back from wherever the sickness had taken her. She didn't cry while she told it. She'd cried enough. And crying hadn't changed anything, hadn't made Mama better or brought back Papa or put food on the table or stopped the cold from creeping in. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face impassive. When Clara finished, he was quiet for a while. "And your father?" he finally asked. "Gone. Left when Elise was a baby. Mama said he went looking for work and never came back." "He abandoned you or die?" Clara shrugged. "Mama never knew for sure. She thought maybe he died. She didn't want to think he'd just left us, but that's probably what happened." "Yes, sir." More silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind continued its assault on the little house, but inside, Clara felt warm for the first time in days, weeks, maybe. "You can stay tonight," Thomas said abruptly. "Both of you. I'll take you to town in the morning, to the preacher. He'll figure out what to do with you." "What will he do with us?" Elise asked, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the house. Thomas looked at her, and something softened very slightly in his expression. "Find you a family, probably. Someone to take you in." "Together?" Clara asked quickly, remembering Mama's words, her warning. "They'll keep us together?" "I don't know." Clara felt Elise's hand find hers under the blanket, felt her sister's fingers squeeze tight. "We have to stay together," Clara said. "We promised Mama." Sometimes promises can't be kept. This one has to be. Thomas turned back to the fire. "Get some sleep. Bedroom's through that door. You can take the bed. I'll sleep out here." "We can sleep out here," Clara said quickly. "We don't want to take your bed." "I said take the bed." There was finality in his tone that didn't allow for argument. Clara stood, pulling Elise up with her, and they made their way to the bedroom. It was small and plain, just a bed, a dresser, and a window covered with a heavy curtain. But the bed was real, with a real mattress, and real pillows and sheets that smelled clean, and when they climbed into it, Elise made a small sound of pure relief. "Clara?" she whispered as they settled under the covers. "Yes?" "Is he going to help us?" Clara thought about Thomas Hale, about his flat eyes and hard voice, and the way he'd almost sent them back into the storm. But she also thought about the blankets he'd given them, the food, the warmth, the bed. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but at least we're safe tonight." "What about tomorrow?" "I don't know that either." Elise was quiet for a moment. Then, "I miss Mama." Clara pulled her sister close, felt tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. "Me too." "What's going to happen to us?" "I don't know," Clara whispered into the darkness. "I don't know." In the main room, Thomas Hale sat by the fire and stared into the flames. He'd meant what he said. He was taking the girls to town in the morning, turning them over to people who'd know what to do with orphans. It wasn't his problem. He didn't know these girls, didn't owe them anything beyond a night's shelter from the storm. But he couldn't stop thinking about the way the older one, Clara, had looked at him when he'd first found them in the barn. Not afraid exactly, though there'd been fear there too, more like resigned. Like she'd expected him to turn them away, had already accepted it, was just waiting for the inevitable. The same look his daughter had given him 5 years ago, in the moment before. Thomas cut the thought off hard, stood up, paced to the window. He didn't think about that. He'd spent 5 years not thinking about it, 5 years building walls around that particular memory, and he wasn't about to tear them down now for 2 stray girls who'd stumbled into his barn. They were going to town in the morning. End of story. But when he finally lay down on the bench near the fire, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of lavender from the last time Elizabeth had... No. He wasn't thinking about that either. When he finally slept, it was to dreams of small voices asking questions he didn't have answers for, and the sound of a storm that seemed like it would never end. Morning came with a silence that felt almost unnatural after the fury of the previous night's storm. Thomas woke to pale sunlight filtering through the window, his back aching from the bench he'd slept on, and for a moment, just a brief, disorienting moment, he forgot about the girls in his bedroom. Then he heard it, the soft muffle of voices, young voices, trying to whisper but not quite managing it. Should we wake him? I don't know. Maybe he's already awake. What if he's angry we're still here? Thomas sat up slowly, running a hand over his face. His whole body felt stiff and old, though he was barely 40. The cold did that to a man, especially when he spent the night on a wooden bench instead of his own bed. He stood and walked to the bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see the two girls sitting on the edge of the bed, still wearing their layered dresses from yesterday. Their hair tangled and their faces smudged with dirt they'd been too exhausted to wash off. Clara saw him first. She straightened immediately, her hand moving protectively to her sister's shoulder. "We're awake," she said unnecessarily. "We can leave whenever you're ready to take us to town." Thomas pushed the door open wider. "You eat breakfast first. We don't want to be any trouble." "Too late for that," he said, but without heat. "Come on." He made them porridge, plain oats cooked with water, nothing fancy, but he added a precious spoonful of honey to the pot and watched the way both girls' eyes widened when they tasted it. They ate slowly, as he'd instructed the night before, but he could see how difficult it was for them to hold back, how hunger made every bite an exercise in restraint. While they ate, Thomas prepared his horse and wagon for the trip to town. 4 miles in the snow wouldn't be pleasant, but the storm had passed and the roads would be passable. He'd drop the girls with Reverend Michaels, maybe give the man a few dollars to help with their immediate needs, and then he'd come back home and forget this had ever happened. That was the plan. But when he came back inside to collect them, he found Clara washing dishes at the basin, the bowls they'd eaten from, the pot he'd cooked in, even the tin cups from last night. She'd rolled up her sleeves and was scrubbing with a rag she must have found under the basin, her movements efficient and practiced. "You don't need to do that," Thomas said. Clara didn't stop. "Mama always said to clean up after yourself. Said it was the least you could do when someone shows you kindness." Elise was standing nearby looking uncertain, clearly wanting to help but not sure how. When she saw Thomas, she took a small step backward. "I swept the bedroom floor," she offered quietly. "I found a broom by the door." Thomas looked from one girl to the other, and something uncomfortable shifted in his chest. They were trying to earn their keep, to make themselves useful, to be worth the trouble they'd caused. It reminded him of... He cut that thought off. "Finish up. We're leaving in 10 minutes. The wagon ride to Greystone was quiet, except for the crunch of wheels on packed snow and the occasional snort from the horse. Thomas had given the girls blankets to wrap up in, and they sat huddled together in the back of the wagon, not speaking, just holding on to each other as the landscape rolled past. Thomas kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel their presence behind him, could sense the weight of what he was about to do. He was delivering them to an uncertain future, handing them off to a preacher who would be kind but ultimately practical, who would find them homes, if any could be found, or send them to an orphanage in Helena or Great Falls or some other distant place where they'd be separated and forgotten. It wasn't his problem. He had to keep reminding himself of that. Greystone appeared through the trees like a collection of buildings that had been dropped randomly into the valley with no particular plan or purpose. There was a main street with a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, a blacksmith, and a handful of other establishments that served the scattered ranchers and farmers who lived in the surrounding area. At the far end of the street stood the church, a small white building with a steeple that listed slightly to the left, as if the wind had been trying for years to knock it over and hadn't quite succeeded. Thomas pulled the wagon up in front of the church and climbed down. The girls didn't move. "Come on," he said. Clara climbed out first, then helped Elise down. They stood in the snow looking small and lost, and Thomas felt that uncomfortable sensation in his chest again. He led them up the steps to the church door and knocked. After a moment it opened to reveal Reverend Michaels, a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and a perpetually worried expression. "Thomas Hale," the Reverend said, surprise evident in his voice. "I haven't seen you at services in quite some time." "I'm not here for services." The Reverend's gaze shifted to the two girls standing behind Thomas. "And who might these young ladies be?" "Clara and Elise Brennan. Their mother died yesterday. They've got no family, no place to go. I thought you might know what to do with them." Reverend Michael's expression shifted immediately to concern. "Catherine Brennan?" she passed. "Yesterday morning, from what the girl says." Poor souls. The Reverend crouched down to the girl's level. "Clara, Elise, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your mother was a good woman. Please, come inside where it's warm." He ushered them into the church, and Thomas followed, feeling oddly like an intruder in the space. It had been 5 years since he'd set foot in this building, not since the funeral he'd refused to attend, even though everyone expected him to, even though Elizabeth had been, "You did the right thing bringing them here," Reverend Michaels was saying. "Though I confess I'm not entirely sure what resources we have available. The territory doesn't have much in the way of services for orphaned children." "There's an orphanage in Helena," Thomas said. "Yes, but—" The Reverend hesitated. "That's a difficult placement. Overcrowded, underfunded, and they'd almost certainly be separated. The facility has separate wings for different age groups." Clara's hand shot out and grabbed Elise's. "We can't be separated. We promised our mama." "I understand, dear, but sometimes circumstances—" "No," Clara said, and there was steel in her voice that seemed too old for her years. "We stay together. That's not negotiable." Reverend Michaels looked helplessly at Thomas. "Perhaps there's a family in the area who might take them both? The Hendersons just lost their eldest daughter to consumption. They might welcome—" "The Hendersons can barely feed themselves," Thomas interrupted, "and they've still got 4 children at home." "What about the Pratts? They left for Oregon last month." "The Williamses, then?" Thomas shook his head. Every name the Reverend suggested, Thomas had a reason why it wouldn't work. Too poor, too many children already, too old, too sick, too unwilling to take on someone else's burden. He knew these families, knew their struggles, and he knew none of them were in a position to take in 2 orphaned girls just out of charity. The Reverend sighed heavily. "Then I'm afraid Helena might be our only option. I can write to them, arrange for transport." "They're not going to Helena," Thomas heard himself say. Everyone looked at him, the Reverend in surprise, Clara in desperate hope, Elise in confusion. "I'm sorry," Reverend Michaels said. Thomas wasn't sure what had made him speak. The words had come out before he'd fully thought them through, driven by something deeper than logic or reason. "I said they're not going to Helena. They'll stay with me." "Thomas, that's very generous, but surely you understand that a single man housing 2 young girls, the appearance of impropriety—" "To hell with appearances." The Reverend flinched at the profanity in his church. "Nevertheless, people will talk. There are expectations, standards of propriety that— Are you saying someone will talk more about me giving 2 orphans shelter than they would about sending those same orphans to an overcrowded orphanage where they'll be separated and forgotten? It's not about what I think. It's about what the community, Thomas said flatly, has done nothing for these girls. They've been starving for weeks from what I can tell, and not one person offered help, so I don't much care what the community thinks." Reverend Michaels opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "How long are you proposing they stay with you?" Thomas hadn't thought that far ahead. He was operating on instinct now, on something that felt almost like anger, but was really more like recognition. The recognition that these girls had been abandoned by everyone who should have helped them, just like he'd been abandoned by everyone who should have understood that he couldn't, wouldn't, didn't know how to— "As long as they need to," he said. Clara was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, exactly. More like suspicion mixed with hope, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Mr. Hale," she said carefully, "you don't have to do this." "I know. We'll be okay. We can go to Helena. We'll figure something out." "I know you would," Thomas said, and meant it. This girl had walked 5 miles through a blizzard carrying her sister, had spent the night in a stranger's barn, had watched her mother die and kept moving forward. She was a survivor. "But you don't have to." Elise tugged on Clara's sleeve. "Does this mean we can stay? In the warm house?" Clara's eyes were still locked on Thomas, searching his face for something. "I don't know. Mr. Hale, why are you doing this?" It was a fair question. Thomas wished he had a good answer. "Because someone should," he finally said, "and nobody else is." Reverend Michaels cleared his throat. "If you're certain about this, Thomas, I won't stand in your way, but I do think we should establish some parameters. Perhaps I could check in weekly, ensure the girls are being properly cared for." "You do that," Thomas said. "Check in all you want, but they're coming home with me." Home. The word felt strange in his mouth. He hadn't thought of his ranch as home in years. It was just a place he lived, a place he worked, a place to exist until existence ended. But the girls needed a home, and he had a house, and somehow those two facts had collided into a decision that terrified him even as he committed to it. They left the church with Reverend Michaels still sputtering about propriety and weekly visits and what people would say. Thomas helped the girls back into the wagon, and as they pulled away from the church, Clara spoke quietly from the back. "Thank you." Thomas didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak, didn't trust the tangle of emotions that had taken up residence in his chest. Instead, he just clicked his tongue at the horse and headed for home. That first week was an exercise in awkwardness and adjustment. The girls moved through the house like ghosts, trying to be invisible, trying not to be a burden. They spoke in whispers when they spoke at all, cleaned up after themselves obsessively, and flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. Thomas gave them the bedroom and moved his things to the main room, sleeping on the bench with blankets and a pillow that did nothing to prevent the backache that became his constant companion. He showed them where everything was: the pump for water, the privy out back, the firewood stacked against the side of the house. He established a basic routine: breakfast at dawn, chores during the day, supper at dusk, bed when the light failed. He wasn't good with words, never had been, but he could provide structure. Structure was something. The girls adapted quickly. Clara proved to be frighteningly competent for a 9-year-old. She could cook basic meals, mend clothes, manage the household tasks that Thomas had been neglecting for years. She attacked everything with an intensity that seemed almost desperate, as if she was trying to prove her worth, to justify the space she and her sister occupied. Elise was quieter, more fragile. She cried sometimes at night. Thomas could hear her through the bedroom door, soft sobs that Clara would soothe with whispered words, and what sounded like the lullabies their mother must have sung. During the day, Elise shadowed her sister, helping where she could but mostly just trying to stay close, as if proximity to Clara was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Thomas tried to give them space while also maintaining a presence. He taught them how to feed the chickens, how to gather eggs without startling the hens, how to curry the horse and check his hooves for stones. He showed Clara how to work the stove properly so it didn't smoke up the house, showed Elise how to card wool from the small flock of sheep he kept. They were small lessons, practical things, but they filled the silence and gave everyone something to focus on besides the strangeness of their new arrangement. On the third day, Clara came to him while he was repairing a section of fence near the barn. "Mr. Hale?" He looked up from the post he was setting. "What is it?" "I was wondering, could we go back to our old place, the shack where we lived with Mama?" Thomas set down his hammer. "Why?" "We left some things. Not much, but there's a photograph of Mama and Papa from before we were born, and Elise has a doll that Mama made her. I know it's not important, but it's important," Thomas cut in. "We'll go tomorrow." The relief on Clara's face was palpable. "Thank you." The next morning, they took the wagon down the valley to the shack Clara had described. Thomas knew the place by sight, a ramshackle structure that looked like it might collapse under the weight of the next good snow. He'd passed it dozens of times over the years and never given it much thought. Now, seeing it through the girl's eyes, he felt something close to anger. This was where they'd lived? This barely standing hovel with gaps in the walls and a roof that was more hole than shingle? Clara led them inside, and Thomas had to duck his head to get through the low doorway. The interior was even worse. One room, maybe 12 feet by 12, with a dirt floor and a makeshift stove cobbled together from scrap metal. There was the bed they'd mentioned, a thin mattress on a wooden frame, and a quilt that still covered the shape of Catherine Brennan's body. Clara pulled the quilt back slowly, and Thomas saw that the woman had already been prepared for burial by someone. Her hands folded across her chest, her eyes closed, her face peaceful despite the hardship that had marked her final days. The cold had preserved her, turning the tiny shack into a temporary tomb. Mrs. Hutchins must have come, Clara said quietly. She wouldn't help while Mama was alive, but I guess she couldn't just leave her like this. Elise wouldn't look at the bed. She'd gone straight to a corner where a small cloth doll lay on the floor, snatching it up and clutching it to her chest. We should bury her properly, Thomas said. Clara shook her head. The ground's too frozen. We tried to dig before we left, but we couldn't break through. I've got tools. We'll manage. It took the better part of the day. Thomas dug while the girls gathered what few possessions they wanted to keep. The photograph Clara had mentioned, the doll, a few pieces of clothing that weren't completely worn through, a small wooden box that contained what looked like letters. When the grave was finally deep enough, Thomas wrapped Catherine Brennan in the quilt and lowered her as gently as he could into the frozen earth. Clara and Elise stood at the graveside holding hands. Neither of them cried, which somehow made it worse. Should we say something? Elise asked. Clara looked at Thomas. He shook his head. I'm not good with words. If you want to say something, you say it. Clara was quiet for a long moment, then, Mama, we're okay. We found somewhere safe, somewhere warm. You don't have to worry about us anymore. We'll take care of each other like you asked. We'll stay together, we promise. It wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. Thomas filled in the grave while the girls watched, and when he was done, Clara placed a smooth stone at the head as a marker. It wasn't much, but it was more than Catherine Brennan would have gotten otherwise. They rode back to the ranch in silence, and that night at supper, Clara spoke for the first time about their mother's final days. She was scared, Clara said, pushing food around her plate. Mama, I mean. At the end. She tried to hide it from us, but I could tell. Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. She kept apologizing. Said she was sorry she couldn't take better care of us, sorry we'd have to manage on our own, sorry for dying. Clara's voice cracked slightly. I told her it wasn't her fault, but I don't think she believed me. It wasn't her fault, Thomas said firmly. Your mother did the best she could with what she had. Was it enough? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and complicated. Thomas thought about Catherine Brennan in that frozen shack, thought about her daughters walking through a blizzard because they had no other choice, thought about the photograph Clara had retrieved, a young couple in their wedding clothes, smiling at a future they thought they understood. She kept you alive, he said finally. She kept you together. She made sure you knew you mattered to each other. That's more than enough. Clara looked at him with those old, too wise eyes. Mr. Hale? Did you have children? The question hit him like a physical blow. Thomas felt his throat close up, felt the familiar walls slam into place around the memories he didn't examine. Once, he managed. What happened to them? Clara, Elise whispered, clearly sensing the shift in Thomas's demeanor. Maybe we shouldn't... It's okay, Thomas said, though it wasn't. I had a daughter, Sarah. She died 5 years ago. She was 6. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I'm sorry, Clara finally said. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Finish your supper, then bed. He walked outside into the cold, needing air, needing distance, needing anything but the sympathy in those girls' eyes or the memories their questions had dredged up. He stood in the yard and stared at the mountains and let the cold seep into his bones until he was numb enough to go back inside. When he came back in, the girls had cleaned up from supper and retreated to the bedroom. Thomas could hear their voices through the door, Clara's low and soothing, Elise's higher and uncertain. Do you think he's mad at us? No, I think he's sad. Because we asked about his daughter? Maybe, or maybe he's sad all the time and we just reminded him of it. Thomas turned away, his chest tight. Out of the mouths of children came truths that adults learn to avoid. Yes, he was sad all the time. Had been for 5 years. The girls hadn't created that sadness, just exposed it. The days began to blur together in a rhythm that was both strange and oddly comforting. Thomas found himself adjusting to the presence of the girls in ways that surprised him. He bought fabric in town so Clara could make them new dresses. He showed them how to set snares for rabbits and check them without getting caught themselves. He taught Elise the names of the constellations on clear nights when the sky was sharp with stars. Small things, quiet things, but they added up to something that resembled life instead of mere existence. Reverend Michaels made his weekly visits, always with a concerned expression and questions about sleeping arrangements and proper supervision. Thomas answered curtly and truthfully. The girls had the bedroom, he had the main room, they were fed and clothed and warm, and if that wasn't proper enough for the good Reverend, he was welcome to take it up with someone who cared. The Reverend never pushed too hard. Thomas suspected he was just as relieved as anyone else that the problem of 2 orphaned girls had been solved without requiring anything from the community at large. On a Sunday morning 2 weeks after the girls had arrived, Clara approached Thomas while he was feeding the chickens. "Mr. Hale, would it be okay if Elise and I went to church?" Thomas scattered feed with perhaps more force than necessary. "Why?" "Mama used to take us sometimes. I thought it might be nice. To do something normal." Normal. The word echoed in Thomas's head. These girls wanted normal when their entire world had been upended, when they'd lost everything and everyone and were living with a stranger who barely spoke to them. "I don't go to church," he said. "I know. But we could go by ourselves. It's not far, and the Reverend would walk us back." Thomas wanted to say no. The thought of people seeing the girls, asking questions, making judgments about his fitness as a guardian, it made his skin crawl. But he looked at Clara's hopeful face and realized he was being selfish. "Fine, but you stay together and you come straight back after." That Sunday, and every Sunday after, the girls walked to church while Thomas stayed home and found work to occupy his hands and tried not to think about the last time he'd sat in a pew, the last time he'd believed in anything beyond the simple fact that life was hard, and then you died, and nothing you did really mattered. It was after one of these Sunday services that things began to shift in a way Thomas hadn't anticipated. The girls came home later than usual, and Clara's face was flushed with something that looked like anger. Elise was crying quietly, and when Thomas asked what happened, Clara's expression hardened. "Some of the women at church were talking. They didn't think we could hear them, but we could." "What were they saying?" "That it wasn't right, us living here with you, that you were a bitter old hermit who didn't know anything about raising children, that we'd end up wild and godless and unmarriageable." Thomas felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. "And what did you say?" "Nothing. Mama always said not to talk back to your elders, even when they're wrong." Clara paused. "But Mr. Hale, they are wrong. You've been kinder to us than anyone else. You gave us a home when nobody else would. That's not godless. That's..." She struggled for words. "That's what people who actually believe in something are supposed to do." Something in Thomas's chest cracked open slightly. He'd expected judgment from the town, had braced for it, even welcomed it as confirmation of everything he already believed about people and their shallow pieties. But he hadn't expected this fierce defense from a 9-year-old girl who barely knew him. "Don't worry about what they say," he told her, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Words don't mean much. But words can hurt. Only if you let them." Clara looked at him with that penetrating gaze that always made him feel seen in ways he didn't particularly want to be seen. "You let them hurt you. The words people said after your daughter died. I can tell." Thomas turned away, busying himself with something, anything. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not, but I know what it looks like when someone's been hurt and hasn't healed. Mama looked like that after Papa left, like there was a piece missing that nothing could fill." "Clara," Elise said softly, "maybe we should go inside." But Clara wasn't finished. "I just want you to know that we appreciate what you're doing, and we don't care what those women say. You're a good man, Mr. Hale, whether you believe it or not." She took Elise's hand and walked into the house, leaving Thomas standing in the yard feeling like he'd been stripped bare and examined and found wanting in ways he couldn't quite name. That night, long after the girls had gone to bed, Thomas sat by the fire and thought about Sarah. Really thought about her, instead of shoving the memories down into the dark places where he usually kept them locked. He thought about her laugh, bright and infectious, her questions, endless and enthusiastic, the way she'd followed him around the ranch, trying to help with chores she was too small to do properly, but doing them anyway because she wanted to be like Papa. He thought about the day she'd gotten sick, the fever that came on fast and fierce, the way she'd looked at him with confused eyes, as if asking him to fix this, to make it better, to do what fathers were supposed to do. He thought about Elizabeth, his wife, Sarah's mother, holding their daughter as the light faded from her eyes. The sound she'd made that wasn't quite a scream, but wasn't quite anything else either, pure grief-given voice. He thought about the weeks after, the months, the way Elizabeth had drifted through the house like a ghost, how they'd stopped talking because there was nothing left to say, how she'd finally left one morning with a note that said she couldn't stay in this house, in this place, with these memories. And she was sorry, but she had to go. He'd let her, hadn't fought, hadn't argued, hadn't asked her to stay. What would have been the point? They were both drowning in separate oceans of grief, and neither of them had the strength to save the other. Now, 5 years later, Thomas sat in the same house where his daughter had died and his wife had left him, and he had 2 new girls sleeping in what used to be Sarah's room, and he didn't know what any of it meant except that life kept happening whether you wanted it to or not. The next morning, he woke to the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute he'd been drinking for the past year. Clara was at the stove, looking pleased with herself. "I found the coffee in the back of the cupboard," she said when she saw him stirring. "Thought you might like some." Thomas accepted the cup she handed him, sipping carefully. It was strong enough to strip paint, but it was coffee, and that counted for something. "Thank you," he said. Clara smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her. "You're welcome." It was a small moment, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But as Thomas sat at his table drinking coffee made by an orphaned girl who was trying so hard to find her place in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty, he felt something shift inside him. Not healing, exactly. Not yet. But maybe the first small movement toward it, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. Outside, the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. Spring was still months away, but for the first time in 5 years, Thomas thought he might actually live to see it. The peace that had settled over Thomas's ranch lasted exactly 6 weeks before it shattered. It started, as most trouble did in small towns, with gossip that festered into concern and then hardened into righteous conviction. The women who'd whispered at church had continued whispering, their voices growing louder with each passing Sunday, until what had begun as idle speculation transformed into something more organized, more dangerous. Thomas first sensed the shift when he went into town for supplies on a gray March morning. The general store, usually filled with the mundane chatter of weather and crops and whose cow had calved, went silent when he walked in. Every eye turned toward him, and in those eyes he saw something that made his jaw tighten, judgment, and worse, pity. "Morning, Thomas," said Bill Crawford, the store owner, his voice carefully neutral. "Bill?" Thomas set his list on the counter. "Need these items when you have a chance." Crawford glanced at the list, then looked up with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Heard you've got the Brennan girls staying with you." "That's right. Must be quite an adjustment. 2 young girls, no woman in the house to help with, well, with things women handle." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "We're managing fine." "I'm sure you are. It's just that people are talking, and let them talk." "Thomas, I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just saying that maybe it would be better for everyone if there was some kind of official arrangement, someone to vouch for the propriety of the situation." "The Reverend checks in weekly. That official enough?" Crawford shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just about what's actually happening. It's about appearances. A single man, 2 young girls, no female supervision. You have to understand how that looks." "I understand perfectly," Thomas said coldly. "I understand that 2 children needed help and nobody offered it until I did. I understand that the same people who are so concerned about appearances now didn't give a damn when those girls were starving. Now, that's not entirely fair, isn't it?" Thomas picked up his list. "You know what? I'll take my business elsewhere." He turned to leave, but Crawford called after him. "Thomas, wait. There's going to be a town meeting, Tuesday night, about the girls. I thought you should know." Thomas stopped, his hand on the door. "A meeting about what exactly?" "About whether the current living arrangement is suitable for the children's welfare." The words hung in the air like a threat. Thomas turned slowly. "And who called this meeting?" "Margaret Whitmore and some of the other ladies. They've gotten the mayor involved. They're bringing in someone from the Territorial Welfare Office. Margaret Whitmore. Thomas knew her, a woman who wore her charity like a badge of honor, who made sure everyone knew about every good deed she performed, every donation she made to the church. She'd lost a son in the war and a husband to drink, and she'd channeled all that loss into controlling everything and everyone she could reach. Tell Mrs. Whitmore and the mayor and whoever else is concerned that those girls are staying with me. There's nothing to discuss. You should come to the meeting anyway. Defend yourself. If you don't show up, they'll make the decision without you. Thomas left without responding, his anger simmering just below the surface. He rode home harder than he should have, pushing the horse faster than was wise on the muddy roads, driven by a fury that was as much about helplessness as it was about injustice. When he got back to the ranch, he found Clara and Elise in the yard. Clara teaching her sister how to tend the vegetable garden they'd started planning for spring. They looked up when they heard the wagon, and Clara's smile faded when she saw his expression. "What happened?" she asked, straightening. Thomas climbed down from the wagon, trying to school his features into something less obviously angry. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Clara was too perceptive for her own good. "Something happened in town, I can tell." "Clara," I said, "is it about us? Did someone say something about us living here?" Thomas looked at her, at this girl who'd already learned too young that the world was cruel and capricious, and he couldn't bring himself to lie. "There's going to be a meeting, Tuesday. Some people think they have a right to decide what's best for you." "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where busybodies stick their noses where they don't belong." Elise had gone very still, her hand clutching the small trowel she'd been using. "Are they going to make us leave?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "They're not." "But what if they try?" "Then they'll have to go through me." Clara studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, we trust you." The simple statement hit Thomas harder than any accusation could have. These girls trusted him. They'd placed their safety, their future, their very lives in his hands, and now the town was going to try to tear that away because it didn't fit their narrow definition of propriety. Tuesday came too quickly. Thomas left the girls with strict instructions to stay inside, to keep the doors locked, to not answer if anyone came calling. He rode into town as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with red and orange that looked like a warning. The meeting was held in the church, of course it was, and the building was more crowded than Thomas had seen it in years. Every pew was filled with townspeople who'd come to watch the spectacle, to have their say, to participate in the communal decision-making that small towns loved and Thomas despised. At the front of the church stood Margaret Whitmore, resplendent in black silk that probably cost more than most families earned in a month. Beside her was Mayor Ernest Dalton, a soft man who'd gotten elected mainly because nobody else wanted the job. And next to them, looking uncomfortable in his traveling clothes, was a thin man with spectacles and an officious air. Reverend Michaels stood to the side, his expression troubled. When he saw Thomas enter, he gave a small nod that might have been support or might have been sympathy. Thomas couldn't tell which. "Ah, Mr. Hale," Margaret Whitmore said, her voice carrying across the church. "How kind of you to join us." Thomas didn't take a seat. He stood in the aisle, arms crossed, and waited. Mayor Dalton cleared his throat. "Thomas, we've asked you here tonight to discuss the living situation of Clara and Elise Brennan. This is Mr. Howard Pembroke from the Territorial Welfare Office. He's here to assess the situation and make recommendations." "Recommendations," Thomas repeated flatly, "about children who aren't in your care and aren't your concern." "They're the concern of this entire community," Margaret cut in. "Two innocent girls living without proper supervision, without a woman's guidance, in a household that, forgive my bluntness, has an unsavory appearance." "Unsavory," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I've given those girls food, shelter, warmth, and safety. What exactly is unsavory about that?" Mr. Pembroke stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Hale, I'm sure you mean well, but you must understand the delicacy of the situation. The Welfare Office has guidelines about appropriate placements for orphaned children. A single man, no matter how well-intentioned, is generally not considered suitable." "Suitable for who? You? The bureaucrats in Helena who've never met these girls and don't give a damn about them?" "Please, let's keep this civil," Mayor Dalton said weakly. Civil? Thomas looked around the room at all the faces watching him. You want civil? Where was this community when those girls were starving? Where were all you concerned citizens when their mother was dying and they had no food, no heat, nowhere to turn? Silence. A few people had the decency to look away. Margaret lifted her chin. We didn't know the extent of their situation. You didn't want to know. That shack they lived in is 2 miles from the Hutchins place and 5 miles from here. People passed it all the time. You all knew Catherine Brennan was struggling, and not one of you offered help. That's hardly fair, Thomas, someone called from the back. We all have our own troubles. Exactly my point. When it was too much trouble to help, you all looked the other way. But now that someone else has solved the problem, suddenly you're all experts on what's best for children you couldn't be bothered to care about 6 weeks ago. Mr. Pembroke held up a hand. Mr. Hale, your defensiveness is understandable, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue. These girls need a proper home with proper supervision. The welfare office has several options. They have a home. A home with appropriate guardianship, preferably a married couple, or at minimum a woman who can provide the kind of care and guidance young girls require. And you have such a placement ready? Thomas challenged. Pembroke hesitated. Not immediately in this area, no, but there are facilities in Helena where they'll be separated. Not necessarily. Don't lie to me. I know how those places work. They'll separate them by age, put them in different wards, and the promise to keep them together will get lost in paperwork and bureaucracy until it's too late to matter. Clara had been specific about that. Her mother's dying wish, the promise she'd made. Stay together, no matter what. Margaret Whitmore's expression hardened. Mr. Hale, your attachment to these children is admirable, but surely you can see that your situation is irregular. You're an unmarried man with no experience raising children, living in isolation, with a history of, she paused delicately, personal tragedy that might affect your judgment. The room went very still. Thomas felt something dark and dangerous unfurl in his chest. Careful, Margaret. I'm simply stating facts. You've been alone for 5 years since your wife left. You've made no effort to remarry, to establish a stable household. You barely interact with this community. And now you suddenly want to take on the responsibility of 2 young girls? Forgive me, but it raises questions. What questions? Thomas's voice was like ice. About your motivations. About whether this is really about helping these children, or about filling a void left by your own loss. A murmur ran through the crowd. Reverend Michaels stepped forward. Margaret, that's enough. Is it? Are we supposed to ignore the obvious? He lost a daughter, and now he's found 2 replacements. That's not healthy for him or for those girls. Thomas took a step forward, and something in his movement made several people stand up, as if anticipating violence. He stopped, forced himself to breathe, to think past the red haze of fury. You want to talk about my motivations? Fine. I took those girls in because they needed help and I could provide it. That's the whole story. It's not complicated, it's not suspicious, and it's sure as hell not any of your business. The welfare of children is everyone's business, Mr. Pembroke interjected. Then where were you 6 weeks ago? Where was the welfare office when those girls were walking through a blizzard with nowhere to go? We can't respond to situations we're not aware of, but you're aware now. And now you want to tear them away from the first stable home they've had in months, maybe years. You want to ship them off to an institution where there'll be numbers in a ledger instead of children with names and histories and promises to keep. Mayor Dalton shifted uncomfortably. Thomas, nobody wants that. We're just trying to ensure you're trying to cover your asses, Thomas cut in. You're trying to make sure that if anything goes wrong, you can say you followed proper procedures, you consulted the experts, you did everything by the book. But those girls aren't a liability to be managed. They're people who deserve better than this. Mr. Hale, Pembroke said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Emotion aside, the law is clear. Orphaned children require proper guardianship, and a single man does not meet the criteria. The welfare office has the authority to remove children from unsuitable placements. Then you'll have to remove me too. The words fell into silence. Thomas could see the confusion on faces, the uncertainty about what he meant. I don't understand, Pembroke said slowly. If you take those girls, you take me with them, because I'm not letting them go without a fight. You want to separate them from the only stability they've known? You'll have to do it by force, and I promise you that won't go quietly or easily. Margaret's eyes widened. Are you threatening violence? I'm stating facts, same as you were. Thomas looked around the room, meeting eyes, daring anyone to challenge him. Those girls came to me with nothing. No family, no home, no hope. I gave them shelter. I gave them food and warmth and a place to belong. And now you want to take that away because it doesn't fit your definition of proper? It's not about definitions, Pembroke said. It's about protecting children. From what? From a man who's kept them safe? From a home where they're fed and clothed and cared for? Or from the judgment of people who care more about appearances than actual welfare? The appearance matters, Margaret insisted. What example does this set? What message does it send when we allow such irregular arrangements? The message it sends, came a new voice from the back of the church, is that people matter more than rules. Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Brooks, a woman Thomas knew by sight but had never spoken to. She was in her 50s, a widow who lived alone on a small property north of town, someone who kept to herself and showed up to community events with the same reluctant regularity as Thomas showed up to nothing at all. She walked down the aisle now, with her shoulders back, her gaze steady, and when she reached the front of the church, she turned to face the crowd. I know most of you don't know me well, Eleanor said. I'm not part of your quilting circles or your charity committees. I don't attend every church service or socialize at every town function, but I've lived here for 30 years and I've watched this community for long enough to know when we're about to make a terrible mistake. Mrs. Brooks, Mayor Dalton said uncertainly, this doesn't really it concerns all of us. Because what we're really discussing here isn't child welfare, it's control. It's the comfort of knowing that everything fits into neat little boxes and nobody does anything that makes us uncomfortable or challenges our assumptions about how things should be. Margaret's face flushed. That's absurd. We're simply following established guidelines. Guidelines written by people who've never had to make the choice between following rules and doing what's right. Eleanor turned to Mr. Pembroke. You say Thomas Hale isn't suitable because he's a single man, but I haven't heard anyone question whether he's fed those girls, clothed them, kept them safe, given them a home. Has anyone actually checked on their welfare? Or are we all just assuming that because the situation doesn't look right, it must not be right? Reverend Michaels cleared his throat. I've been visiting weekly, as requested. The girls are well cared for. They're healthy, properly dressed, and clearly comfortable in Mr. Hale's home. But comfort isn't the only consideration, Pembroke argued. There are developmental needs, educational requirements, social integration, all of which can be addressed without tearing these children away from a stable home, Eleanor interrupted. Here's what I propose. I'll move into Thomas Hale's household as a live-in housekeeper and chaperone. That satisfies your need for female supervision and propriety. The girls stay together, stay in a home where they're wanted, and this community can rest easy knowing everything looks proper. The church erupted in murmurs. Thomas stared at Eleanor Brooks, completely blindsided. Mrs. Brooks, he said slowly, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm choosing to. Same as you chose to help those girls when nobody else would. She looked at him directly. Unless you're opposed to the idea? Thomas's mind raced. Having someone else in his house, in his space, disrupting the careful solitude he'd maintained for 5 years, every instinct told him to refuse. But he looked at Eleanor's steady gaze and saw something he recognized, determination born of knowing what it felt like to be judged and found wanting by people who didn't understand. I'm not opposed, he said quietly. Margaret sputtered. This is highly irregular. More irregular than shipping 2 children off to an overcrowded institution? Eleanor countered. More irregular than separating siblings who've already lost everything? I don't think so. Mr. Pembroke removed his spectacles, cleaned them, replaced them. Mrs. Brooks, I appreciate your offer, but this isn't a decision to be made lightly. You'd be taking on significant responsibility. I'm well aware. I've raised 3 children of my own and buried 2 of them. I know what responsibility looks like. Her voice softened slightly. I know what loss looks like too. And I know that sometimes the right thing to do doesn't come in a neat package with a bow on top. The territorial agent looked at the mayor, who looked at Margaret, who looked like she'd swallowed something sour. The silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Finally, Pembroke sighed. If Mrs. Brooks is willing to provide supervision, and if Reverend Michaels continues his weekly visits, and if the girls show no signs of distress or neglect, then I suppose the welfare office could approve this arrangement on a provisional basis. Provisional? Thomas demanded. For 6 months, after which we'll reassess the situation and determine if permanent guardianship can be established. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the alternative. Thomas looked at Eleanor, who gave him a slight nod. Fine, he said. 6 months. Margaret wasn't ready to concede. This is a mistake. You're all going to regret this when what, Margaret? Eleanor turned to face her. When those girls grow up healthy and happy because someone actually cared about them instead of about propriety? When they have a chance at a real life instead of being warehoused in an institution? Tell me, what exactly are we supposed to regret? Margaret had no answer. She gathered her skirts and swept out of the church, several of her supporters following. The remaining townspeople began to disperse, most looking uncomfortable, some looking approving, all of them clearly ready for the spectacle to be over. Mr. Pembroke approached Thomas and Eleanor. I'll need to file paperwork with the territorial office. You should expect an official visit in the next few weeks to document the living situation. Fine, Thomas said curtly. The agent left, and then it was just Thomas, Eleanor, and Reverend Michaels standing in the empty church. That was quite something, the Reverend said quietly. Mrs. Brooks, your offer was very generous. It was necessary, Eleanor corrected. I won't stand by and watch this community destroy something good just because it makes them uncomfortable. Thomas found his voice. Why? You don't know me. You don't owe me or those girls anything. Eleanor's expression softened. I know what it's like to be on the outside. My husband drank himself to death, and half this town acted like it was my fault for not being a good enough wife. When my children got sick, scarlet fever, people whispered that it was punishment for my failures. I learned quickly that this community's compassion has limits, and those limits are defined by conformity. I'm sorry, Thomas said, inadequate but sincere. Don't be sorry. Just let me help. I have a small house that I rent out for income, so I can afford to do this. And honestly, she smiled slightly. I'm tired of living alone with nothing but my thoughts for company. Perhaps we can all benefit from this arrangement. Thomas didn't know what to say. This woman had just upended her entire life to defend 2 children she'd never met and a man she barely knew, all because it was the right thing to do. Thank you, he finally managed. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see if you can tolerate having me underfoot. Eleanor straightened her shawl. I'll need a few days to arrange my affairs and pack my things. Shall we say Saturday? Saturday, Thomas agreed, still slightly dazed. Eleanor left, and Thomas was alone with the Reverend. You made an enemy tonight, Michaels said. Margaret Whitmore doesn't forget slights. I've had enemies before. Still, be careful. This isn't over. Thomas looked at the altar, at the cross hanging above it, at all the symbols of faith he'd long since abandoned. It never is. He rode home through the darkness, his thoughts churning. Everything had changed again, just when he'd started to find a rhythm. Now there would be Eleanor Brooks in his house, officials checking up on them, the constant scrutiny of a community that had already decided he was doing something wrong. When he got back to the ranch, he found both girls sitting on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, clearly waiting for him. Well? Claire asked as soon as he dismounted. Thomas climbed the porch steps and sat down beside them. He told them everything, the meeting, the arguments, Eleanor's offer, the provisional approval. When he finished, Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then, people really don't want us here. People don't know what they want. They just know they're uncomfortable with anything different. Are you uncomfortable with us being here? Thomas looked at her, at Elise pressed against her sister's side, at these 2 small people who'd disrupted his careful solitude and forced him back into a world he'd tried to leave behind. Sometimes, he admitted, but not because of you, because I'm afraid of... He stopped, unsure how to explain. Of losing us. Elise asked quietly. The words hit him like a punch. Yes, that was exactly what he was afraid of. He'd lost Sarah, lost Elizabeth, lost everything that mattered, and letting these girls into his life meant risking that kind of loss again. Yes, he said simply. Clara reached out and took his hand, a gesture so unexpected and so trusting that Thomas felt his throat tighten. You won't lose us, she said firmly. We're not going anywhere. You said we were home, remember? He had said that, in a moment of impulse outside the Reverend's office. Then you're already home. He'd meant it as comfort, as reassurance, but Clara had taken it as a promise. I remember, Thomas said. Then that's all that matters. The rest is just noise. Just noise. Thomas wished he could believe it was that simple. But as they sat together on the porch, the three of them against whatever came next, he thought maybe Clara was wiser than he'd given her credit for. Maybe she was wiser than all of them. Saturday came with this kind of spring rain that turned the roads to mud and made the whole world smell like wet earth and new beginnings. Thomas stood on the porch watching a wagon approach through the drizzle, carrying Eleanor Brooks and what looked like half a household's worth of belongings strapped down under oilcloth. Behind him, Clara and Elise peered through the doorway, nervous and curious in equal measure. What if she doesn't like us? Elise whispered. She chose to come here, Clara reminded her. She must like us enough already. Thomas wasn't so sure. Eleanor had made a grand gesture at the town meeting, had stood up for them when nobody else would, but that didn't mean she actually wanted to live with a taciturn rancher and two orphaned girls. People made promises in the heat of the moment that they regretted in the cold light of day. But when Eleanor climbed down from the wagon, her expression was calm and resolute. She looked at the house, at the barn, at the muddy yard, and nodded as if she'd just confirmed something she'd already suspected. Well, she said, it's not the worst place I've seen. Thomas almost smiled. High praise. I deal in honesty, Mr. Hale, not flattery. You'll find I'm better with both than most people. She turned to the girls who'd ventured onto the porch. And you must be Clara and Elise. I'm Eleanor Brooks, and I'll be staying here to make certain this arrangement satisfies all the proper authorities who seem to think children need more than food and shelter to thrive. There was a dry humor in her tone that made Clara's lips quirk. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Brooks. We'll see if you still think so after you've lived with me for a week. I'm told I'm quite particular about how things should be done. Eleanor gestured to the wagon. Now, I've brought more than I probably need, but I wasn't sure what the household already had. Mr. Hale, if you could help me unload, I'd be grateful. They spent the next hour hauling Eleanor's belongings into the house. She'd brought clothing and linens, kitchen implements and preserves, books and sewing supplies, even a small rocking chair that she said had belonged to her mother. Thomas cleared out a corner of the main room for her. She'd insisted she didn't need the bedroom, that the girls should keep it, and that she was perfectly comfortable with a privacy screen and a cot. I've slept in worse, she said when Thomas protested, and I'm a light sleeper anyway. This way I can keep the fire going through the night. As they worked, Thomas found himself watching Eleanor with a kind of wary curiosity. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, not asking permission but not presuming ownership either. She examined the kitchen, made mental notes about organization, checked the stores of food and supplies with an appraising eye. You keep a decent larder, she observed. Better than I expected for a man living alone. The girls need to eat. Yes, but you've been feeding them well. I can see it in their faces. They're filling out, getting color back. She paused, hands on her hips. You've done right by them, Mr. Hale. Whatever else happens, remember that. The words settled something in Thomas's chest that he hadn't realized needed settling. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and went back to unloading the wagon. By evening, Eleanor had established herself in the household with a quiet authority that somehow didn't feel intrusive. She cooked supper, a proper stew with vegetables and meat, rich and hearty, while the girls set the table and Thomas tended to the animals. When they all sat down together, it felt almost like a family, though none of them would have said so out loud. Tell me about your days, Eleanor said, looking at the girls. What do you do to occupy yourselves? Clara glanced at Thomas before answering. Chores mostly. Feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, helping Mr. Hale with whatever needs doing, and I've been teaching Elise her letters. You can read? Mama taught me. She said education was the one thing nobody could take from you, no matter how poor you were. Eleanor's expression softened. Your mother was a wise woman, and you, Elise. Do you enjoy learning your letters? Elise nodded shyly. Claire's a good teacher. She's patient, not like the schoolmaster in our old town. He used to hit kids with a ruler when they got things wrong. Did he now? Eleanor's voice went flat and hard. Well, there'll be none of that here. Learning should come from curiosity, not fear. Over the next few days, Eleanor transformed the household in subtle ways. She reorganized the kitchen for better efficiency, started a proper garden plan for spring planting, mended clothes that Thomas hadn't even realized needed mending. She established routines, specific times for meals, for lessons, for chores, that gave the day's structure without feeling restrictive. But more than that, she brought conversation. Eleanor had opinions on everything and wasn't shy about sharing them. She talked about the territorial legislature and their incompetence, about the price of goods and the greed of merchants, about the neighbors and their various virtues and failings. She debated with Clara about the best way to preserve vegetables, taught Elise songs from her own childhood, and even drew Thomas into discussions about ranching and land management that he found himself unexpectedly enjoying. You're more intelligent than you let on, she said to him one evening after the girls had gone to bed. You hide behind silence, but I can tell you're thinking more than you say. Thomas was repairing a harness by lamplight. Talking hasn't done me much good in the past. Or perhaps you just haven't found the right listeners. Eleanor was working on a quilt, her needle moving with practiced precision. Your wife, Elizabeth, was it? Did she listen? Thomas's hand stilled. How do you know about Elizabeth? Small town, people talk. I know she left after your daughter died. I know you've been alone ever since. Then you know enough. Do I? Because what I don't know is whether you've dealt with any of it, or if you've just buried it so deep you can pretend it doesn't exist. Thomas set down the harness, his jaw tight. That's not your concern, Mrs. Brooks. It is if it affects those girls. They've already lost one parent to death. They don't need to lose another to grief that won't heal. I'm not their parent. Aren't you? You feed them, shelter them, protect them, worry about them. What else does parenting require? Thomas stood abruptly. I'm going to check the barn. He left before Eleanor could respond, stepping out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped, leaving the sky clear and full of stars, and Thomas stood in the yard breathing hard, trying to calm the anger and pain that Eleanor's words had stirred up. He wasn't their parent. He was just someone who'd taken them in because nobody else would. There was a difference, and maintaining that difference was the only way he could keep doing this without falling apart. But when he came back inside an hour later, Eleanor was still sitting by the fire, her quilt laid aside. I apologize, she said quietly. I pushed too hard. It's a failing of mine. I see something that needs addressing, and I go at it like a bull at a gate. Thomas sat down across from her. You're not wrong about any of it. I just don't know what you expect me to do about it. I expect nothing. But I hope you might consider that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Sarah was 6, Thomas finally said, bright and curious and full of life. She got sick so fast we didn't even have time to send for the doctor. One day she was fine, the next she was burning with fever, and 3 days later she was gone. Eleanor listened without interruption. Elizabeth blamed me. Or maybe she blamed herself and couldn't live with it, so she left. Either way, I lost both of them. Thomas stared into the fire. I told myself I was fine alone, that I didn't need anyone, didn't want anyone. And then these 2 girls showed up and ruined everything. Ruined it how? Made me care again. Made me feel again. Made me remember what it's like to worry about someone other than myself. And that's a bad thing? It is when you know how much it hurts to lose. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. My youngest son was 8 when the fever took him. My daughter was 10. My husband drank himself into an early grave rather than face a world without them. I know about loss, Mr. Haley. I know about pain so deep you think it might actually kill you. Then you understand why I'm afraid. I do. But I also know that hiding from pain means hiding from everything else too. Joy, love, connection. You can't have one without risking the other. Thomas looked at her. Is that why you offered to help? Because you were tired of hiding? Eleanor smiled slightly. Partly. And partly because I saw a man and two girls who needed each other but were all too scared to admit it. I thought maybe I could help build a bridge. You're very presumptuous, Mrs. Brooks. I prefer to think of it as insightful. Despite everything, Thomas felt a laugh escape. It was a rusty sound, unpracticed but real. Eleanor's smile widened. There, that wasn't so hard, was it? The next Sunday when the girls went to church, Eleanor accompanied them. Thomas watched them walk down the road together. Clara and Elise in their mended dresses, Eleanor in her simple black, all three of them with their backs straight and their heads high. When they returned, Clara was agitated in a way Thomas hadn't seen before. What happened? He asked. Mrs. Whitmore happened, Eleanor said grimly. She made some comments about our living arrangement that were inappropriate for church or anywhere else. What kind of comments? Clara's jaw was set in a hard line. She said we were all living in sin, that you were corrupting us, and Eleanor was enabling it, and that decent people should shun us until we came to our senses and accepted proper Christian charity. Thomas felt rage bloom hot and immediate. She said that to you? To children? She said it loud enough for the whole congregation to hear, Eleanor corrected. And when I confronted her, she had the audacity to say she was speaking truth in love. There was nothing loving about it, Elise added quietly. It was mean. She wanted to hurt us. Thomas was already reaching for his coat. I'm going into town. Thomas, no. Eleanor caught his arm. That's exactly what she wants. She's trying to provoke you into doing something she can use against you. I don't care. Well, you should care. Think about the girls. If you go into town and make a scene, you'll just prove her point that you're not fit to care for them. Thomas knew she was right, but it didn't make the fury any less intense. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to not act on the impulse that demanded he defend what was his. So we just let her say whatever she wants? For now, yes, we take the high road. We prove her wrong by being exactly what we are, a household that works, that cares for its members, that does right by these children. It wasn't satisfying, but it was smart. Thomas nodded slowly, then looked at Clara and Elise. I'm sorry you had to hear that. It's not your fault, Clara said. Mrs. Whitmore is just angry that her way didn't win. Still, you shouldn't have to deal with that kind of poison. Mama used to say that people who are hurting try to hurt others. Maybe Mrs. Whitmore is hurting. Thomas was constantly surprised by Clara's capacity for understanding. At 9 years old, she could see nuance that most adults missed. But Eleanor shook her head. Some people are just cruel, dear. Not because they're hurting, but because they enjoy the power it gives them. Margaret Whitmore is one of those people. The weeks that followed were tense. Margaret's comments had emboldened others who shared her views, and the girls came home from church each Sunday with new stories of whispered conversations and pointed looks. Some of the children they'd started to befriend were forbidden from playing with them. The shopkeepers in town remained polite but distant, and Thomas could feel the judgment in every transaction. But there were also small acts of support that came from unexpected places. Old Mrs. Hutchins, who'd turned them away when their mother was dying, showed up one day with a basket of preserves and a gruff apology. I was wrong, she said simply. Wrong not to help before, wrong to judge after. These are for the girls. Bill Crawford at the general store started slipping extra supplies into their orders, a bag of candy for the girls, a new wool blanket, small things he claimed were overstocked, though Thomas knew better. And Eleanor's presence made a difference. She was known in town, if not well-liked, then at least respected, and her endorsement carried weight. When Margaret tried to rally more support for her campaign against Thomas's household, Eleanor met her in the street and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Margaret, I've been living with Mr. Hale and those girls for a month now. I've seen how he treats them with kindness and respect. I've seen how they're thriving under his care. So whatever narrative you're trying to spin, it doesn't match reality. You're blinded by what? By actually being there? By seeing the truth instead of inventing scandals? Eleanor's voice was sharp. You claim to care about children's welfare, but I think you care more about being right than about what's actually best for Clara and Elise." The confrontation became town legend. People took sides, and while Margaret still had her supporters, Eleanor's plain speaking had shifted the balance. The scrutiny didn't disappear, but it lessened. The pressure eased. Then the official visit came. Mr. Pembroke arrived on a Tuesday morning, unannounced, as was apparently his prerogative, with a leather satchel and an expression of professional skepticism. He interviewed each of them separately. Thomas in the barn, Eleanor in the kitchen, the girls in the bedroom. He examined the house, checked the food stores, reviewed the sleeping arrangements, made notes in a small book that he kept close to his chest. Thomas hated every minute of it. The invasion of privacy, the assumption that he needed to prove himself to bureaucrats who knew nothing about his life or his choices. But he answered every question, showed every corner of the house, and tried to keep his resentment from showing. When Pembroke finished with the girls, he called everyone together in the main room. "I've completed my assessment," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "The living conditions are adequate. The children appear healthy and well cared for. Mrs. Brooks's presence addresses previous concerns about propriety." Thomas waited for the other shoe to drop. "However," Pembroke continued, "there are still questions about the long-term viability of this arrangement. Mr. Haley, you have no legal relationship to these children, no adoption papers, no formal guardianship. What happens if you decide this is too difficult? What happens if Mrs. Brooks chooses to leave?" "I won't leave," Eleanor said firmly. "With respect, Mrs. Brooks, you can't guarantee that. Circumstances change, health fails, financial situations deteriorate." "Then we'll deal with those circumstances when and if they arise," Thomas said. "But I'm not abandoning these girls. Your intentions are admirable, but intentions aren't legally binding. I'm recommending to the territorial office that formal guardianship papers be drawn up and filed. It will give you legal standing and give these children security." Thomas hadn't considered that. Guardianship meant paperwork, meant officiality, meant committing in a way that went beyond just providing shelter. "What does that involve?" he asked. "Court proceedings, character witnesses, a more thorough background investigation. It's not simple, but it's necessary if you want to ensure these children can't be removed by future bureaucrats who might have different opinions than mine." Clara's hand found Thomas's. He looked down at her, at the trust in her eyes, and felt the weight of what was being asked. Legal guardianship, permanent responsibility, a formal declaration that these girls were his to raise, to protect, to provide for. It terrified him. It also felt inevitable. "Then let's start the process," he said. Pembroke nodded, making another note. "I'll file my report recommending approval. Expect to hear from the court within a few months." After he left, the house felt too quiet. Eleanor made tea, and they all sat around the table, not quite looking at each other. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked Thomas. "Guardianship is permanent. It's not something you can change your mind about later." "I'm sure." "Well, even knowing what it means? The responsibility? The commitment?" Thomas looked at the girls. Clara met his eyes steadily, but Elise was chewing her lip, clearly worried. "What is it, Elise?" he asked gently. "What if you regret it? What if we're too much trouble and you wish you never met us?" The question broke something in Thomas's chest. He knelt down so he was at her level. "Listen to me, both of you. When you showed up in my barn that night, you scared the hell out of me, not because of who you were, but because I'd spent 5 years making sure I didn't care about anyone. I thought if I didn't care, I couldn't hurt." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But you made me care anyway. You reminded me that life isn't just about protecting yourself from pain. It's about finding things worth the risk of pain. And you're worth that risk." Clara's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "You really mean that?" "I really mean that. You're not going anywhere. You're home. I said it once, and I'll keep saying it until you believe it." Elise launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his neck. Thomas caught her automatically, holding her close while she cried into his shoulder. Clara joined them a moment later, and Thomas found himself at the center of a tangle of girls and emotions he'd sworn he'd never feel again. Over Clara's head, he saw Eleanor watching with tears on her own cheeks. She raised her teacup in a small salute, and Thomas understood what she was really saying. "You did it. You let yourself care. You chose love over fear." He nodded back, acknowledgement and gratitude, and something like hope all wrapped into one small gesture. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Thomas sat on the porch and thought about the journey that had brought them all here. Two girls walking through a blizzard, a man who'd given up on life finding reasons to live, a woman who'd chosen compassion over comfort. It wasn't a perfect family. It wasn't even a conventional one, but it was real, and it was theirs, and Thomas would fight anyone who tried to take it away. Inside, he could hear Eleanor humming as she worked on her quilt. In the bedroom, Clara was reading to Elise from one of the books Eleanor had brought. Normal sounds. Family sounds. Thomas stood and went back inside, closing the door on the cold and the dark. There would be more challenges ahead. Margaret Whitmore wasn't done, and the court process would be difficult. But they'd face it together, this makeshift family built from necessity and stubbornness and unexpected grace. And that, Thomas thought, was more than enough. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the Montana landscape from white and gray to every shade of green imaginable. The garden Eleanor and the girls had planted began to sprout, tiny shoots pushing through the dark soil with a determination that reminded Thomas of the girls themselves, fragile-looking but stronger than anyone expected. The court proceedings for guardianship had been set for late May, giving Thomas 2 months to prepare. Eleanor helped him gather the necessary documents, proof of property ownership, character references, financial records demonstrating he could support the girls. Reverend Michaels agreed to testify, as did Bill Crawford and several other townspeople who'd come around to supporting the arrangement. But Margaret Whitmore wasn't finished. She'd spent the winter building her own case, gathering her own witnesses, preparing her own arguments for why Thomas Hale was unfit to raise children. Thomas heard about it through the town grapevine, how Margaret had hired a lawyer from Helena, how she was planning to present evidence of his unsuitability, how she'd convinced several prominent families to support her position. "Let her try," Eleanor said when Thomas mentioned it. "We have truth on our side. That counts for something." "Does it?" "In a courtroom full of people who've already made up their minds. In a courtroom where the judge will see two healthy, happy children who clearly love the man who's taking care of them. Yes, it counts." Thomas wanted to believe her, but as the court date approached, his anxiety grew. He found himself watching the girls more closely, noticing little things, how Clara had started laughing more freely, how Elise no longer flinched at sudden movements, how they'd both begun to relax into the security of routine and consistency. He'd given them that, and the thought of someone taking it away, of sending them back into uncertainty and fear, made him physically ill. The night before the hearing, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring into the flames and trying to prepare himself for every possible outcome. What would he do if the judge ruled against him? Could he fight it? Should he run with the girls, disappear into the territories where no one would find them? "You're catastrophizing," Eleanor's voice came from behind her privacy screen. "I can hear you thinking from here. I thought you were asleep. How can I sleep when you're radiating anxiety loud enough to wake the dead?" She emerged in her nightgown and wrapper, settling into the chair across from him. "Talk to me." "There's nothing to talk about. Tomorrow we'll go to court, and either the judge will grant guardianship or he won't. And you're convinced he won't." "I'm convinced that Margaret Whitmore is relentless, and she has resources I don't have, and she's very good at making people see things her way." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Do you know why she's doing this? It's not really about the girls." "What do you mean?" "Margaret lost her son in the war, lost her husband to grief and alcohol. She never recovered from those losses, and she deals with it by controlling everything and everyone she can reach. You represent something she can't control, a man who made his own decision about his own life without asking her permission or following her rules. That's what this is really about." "Then she's destroying 2 children's lives out of spite." "No, she's destroying them because she genuinely believes she's right. That's what makes her dangerous. She thinks she's saving those girls from you." Thomas rubbed his face. "How do I fight that?" "By being exactly who you are. By telling the truth. By trusting that the judge can see past rhetoric to reality." Eleanor leaned forward. "Thomas, I've watched you with those girls. I've seen how you've changed from the man who first found them in his barn. You were so determined not to care, so convinced that caring would destroy you. But you let them in anyway. You chose love over safety. That takes more courage than Margaret Whitmore will ever understand." What if it's not enough? Then we'll deal with it, together. But I don't think it will come to that. Thomas wanted to share her confidence, but all he could think about was Clara's voice that first night. Our mama died. We got nowhere to go. He'd given them somewhere to go, somewhere to be, somewhere to belong. The thought of taking that away felt like a betrayal of everything he'd promised. Morning came too quickly. Thomas, Eleanor, and the girls dressed in their best clothes, which wasn't saying much, but they looked respectable. Clara had braided Elise's hair in her own, and both girls wore the new dresses Eleanor had sewn for them. They looked like what they were. Children who were cared for, who were loved, who had finally found stability after months of chaos. The courthouse in Greystone was the largest building in town, a two-story structure that served multiple purposes: courtroom, town hall, and meeting space. When they arrived, it was already crowded. Thomas saw Margaret Whitmore holding court with her supporters, saw the lawyer she'd hired looking smug and confident, saw the townspeople who'd come to watch the spectacle. He also saw the people who'd come to support them: Bill Crawford and his wife, Mrs. Hutchins, leaning on her cane, a handful of other families who'd quietly indicated their approval of Thomas's guardianship, and Reverend Michaels, looking nervous but determined. Quite a turnout, Eleanor murmured. They love a good show. Then let's give them one worth watching. The judge was a man named Harlow Pierce, brought in from Helena specifically for this case. He was in his 60s with iron gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every kind of human foolishness and weren't impressed by any of it. He took his seat at the bench and surveyed the room with the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. This is a hearing to determine the suitability of Thomas Hale as legal guardian to Clara and Elise Brennan, he announced. I've read the preliminary reports from the Territorial Welfare Office. Now I want to hear from the interested parties. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you filed an objection? Margaret stood, smoothing her expensive dress. Yes, Your Honor. I and several concerned citizens believe that Mr. Hale's household is not an appropriate environment for young girls. On what grounds? On the grounds that Mr. Hale is an unmarried man with no experience raising children, who has been living in isolation for years following a personal tragedy that calls his judgment into question. These girls deserve a proper family, a married couple with the means and the moral foundation to raise them correctly. And you have such a family prepared to take them? Margaret hesitated just slightly. Not immediately in Greystone, but there are several suitable options in Helena. Options that would separate the girls? Possibly, but that's not necessarily... Mrs. Whitmore, I've read your filing. You recommend an orphanage placement, is that correct? As a temporary measure until permanent families can be found, yes. Temporary? Judge Pierce repeated, his tone dry. In my experience, temporary placements in overcrowded institutions tend to become permanent, but we'll return to that. Mr. Hale, would you approach? Thomas stood, his heart pounding. He walked to the front of the courtroom, very aware of every eye on him. Tell me about the night you found these girls, the judge said. Thomas told the story. The storm, the barn, the two small figures huddled in the hay. Clara's flat statement about their mother's death. The decision he'd made to give them shelter, just for one night, that had turned into something more. Why didn't you take them to town immediately? The judge asked. It was late, the storm was getting worse, and they were exhausted. It seemed cruel to drag them another 4 miles through that weather. And after the storm passed? Thomas paused. I took them to Reverend Michaels, asked him what to do with them. He suggested the orphanage in Helena. I said they'd stay with me instead. Why? It was the question Thomas had been asking himself for months. Why had he made that choice? Why had he taken on responsibility he didn't want for children he didn't know? Because nobody else would, he said finally. Because I looked at those girls and saw what would happen if I didn't help them. They'd be separated, institutionalized, forgotten. And I couldn't let that happen. Even though you had no obligation to them? Obligation has nothing to do with it. It was just the right thing to do. Judge Pierce made a note. Mrs. Brooks, you're living in Mr. Hale's household now. Is that correct? Eleanor stood. Yes, Your Honor. I moved in 2 months ago to provide female supervision and address concerns about propriety. And what have you observed during that time? I've observed a man who feeds those girls 3 meals a day, who makes sure they're clothed and warm, who teaches them skills they'll need to survive. I've observed 2 children who were skeletal and terrified when they arrived, and who are now healthy and happy. I've observed a household that functions on respect and care rather than rules and fear. You sound like an advocate, Mrs. Brooks. I am an advocate. I'm advocating for common sense over bureaucracy, for reality over reputation, for what's actually good for these children rather than what looks good on paper. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Pierce's expression didn't change, but Thomas thought he saw a flicker of approval in his eyes. Reverend Michaels, you've been making weekly visits. What's your assessment? The Reverend stood, looking uncomfortable with the attention. Your Honor, I was skeptical at first. I shared some of the concerns that Mrs. Whitmore has raised, but over the past 4 months, I've watched this household develop into something genuine. Mr. Hale may be unconventional, but he's providing exactly what those girls need: stability, safety, and someone who cares about their welfare. Have you observed anything inappropriate? Nothing whatsoever. The living arrangements are proper. The girls are well supervised, and there's genuine affection between them and Mr. Hale. Margaret's lawyer stood. Lawyer. Your Honor, affection isn't the issue. The issue is whether a single man, regardless of his intentions, can provide the kind of environment these girls need to develop into proper young women. Define proper, Judge Pierce said. The lawyer blinked. I'm sorry? You used the word proper twice in one sentence. I want to know what you mean by it. Well, proper moral guidance, proper feminine influence, proper preparation for their futures as wives and mothers. Mrs. Brooks provides feminine influence, the judge interrupted. The girls attend church regularly, which addresses moral guidance. As for preparation for future roles, that seems rather premature given that one is 9 and the other is 7. What else? The lawyer fumbled. It's about the overall environment, Your Honor, the appearance of the situation. I'm not interested in appearances. I'm interested in facts. Do these girls have adequate food, shelter, and clothing? Yes, but are they being educated? In a limited fashion, though there's no formal schooling. There's no formal school within reasonable distance, Eleanor interjected. I've been teaching them myself. Clara can read and write at a level well beyond her age, and Elise is learning quickly. Judge Pierce turned to his notes again. I'd like to speak with the girls. Clara and Elise, please approach. Thomas felt Clara's hand slip into his as she passed. She looked up at him with worried eyes, and he managed what he hoped was a reassuring nod. The girls stood before the bench, small and vulnerable but standing straight. Judge Pierce studied them for a long moment, then leaned forward. Clara, I understand you're 9 years old, is that correct? Yes, sir. Tell me about living with Mr. Hale. Clara glanced back at Thomas, then faced the judge squarely. He saved our lives. When our mama died, we had nowhere to go. We would have frozen if he hadn't taken us in. He's fed us and clothed us and given us a home. He's kind, even though he pretends not to be. He's teaching us how to take care of ourselves. And he's never once made us feel like we're a burden, even though I know we are. You're not a burden, Thomas said quietly. Judge Pierce held up a hand. Mr. Hale, please. Clara, why do you think you're a burden? Because we eat his food and take up his space and we can't pay him back. But he says we don't have to, that just being here is enough. Her voice wavered slightly. I don't want to leave. Neither does Elise. We're happy here. We're safe here. Isn't that what matters? It's certainly part of what matters. Elise, what about you? Are you happy living with Mr. Hale? Elise nodded vigorously. He's nice. He carved me a horse out of wood, and he lets me help feed the chickens, and he doesn't yell when I make mistakes. And Eleanor tells us stories, and Clara teaches me letters, and we have a real bed and enough to eat, and... She stopped, tears spilling over. Please don't make us leave, please. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Thomas watched tears on Clara's cheeks too, watched both girls trying to be brave while pleading for the only stability they'd known. Judge Pierce's expression softened almost imperceptibly. No one's making any decisions yet, child. I just need to understand the situation. Now, both of you return to your seats. The girls came back to Thomas, and he put an arm around each of them, not caring what it looked like or what anyone thought. They were trembling, and he was furious that they'd been put in this position, that they had to defend their own happiness to a room full of strangers. Margaret's lawyer called several witnesses, townspeople who testified to Thomas's reclusiveness, his grief-driven isolation, his general unfitness for society. They weren't malicious, exactly, just convinced that their version of proper living was the only acceptable one. Then Margaret herself took the stand. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said, "you seem very invested in this case. Why?" "Because those girls deserve better than what they're getting. They deserve a real family, a proper upbringing, opportunities that an isolated ranch can't provide." "What opportunities specifically?" "Education, culture, social connections, marriage prospects." "They're 9 and 7, the judge interrupted. "Marriage prospects seem rather distant. But it's never too early to start preparing for—" "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm going to be frank with you. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've seen a lot of children in difficult situations. I've seen orphans in institutions, and I've seen orphans in foster homes, and I've seen orphans with guardians who took them in for various reasons. What I've learned is that what children need most isn't opportunity or culture or preparation for distant futures. What they need is someone who cares whether they live or die, someone who'll feed them when they're hungry and comfort them when they're scared and fight for them when the world tries to grind them down. Can you honestly tell me that an orphanage in Helena will provide that better than what these girls have now?" Margaret's face flushed. "With respect, Your Honor, you're being reductive. There are broader considerations. Answer the question. Will those girls be better off in an institution than they are now?" The silence stretched. Finally, Margaret said, "They would be better off with a proper family." "But you don't have a proper family ready to take them. What you have is an ideal that doesn't exist, at least not in a form that would keep them together. So I'll ask again, will they be better off in an institution?" "In the long term, perhaps." "That's not an answer." Margaret's composure cracked. "I'm trying to do what's right. I'm trying to prevent a tragedy before it happens. Mr. Hale lost a child once. What happens when history repeats itself? What happens when his grief overwhelms him again and those girls pay the price?" Thomas stood. "Your Honor, may I respond?" Judge Pierce nodded. Thomas turned to face Margaret directly. "You're right. I lost a child. I lost my daughter Sarah, and it nearly destroyed me. I spent 5 years hiding from the world because I couldn't face what I'd lost. But then these girls showed up, and they didn't give me a choice about whether to care. They just existed, and they needed help, and I helped them. And yes, I'm terrified every single day that something will happen to them. But that fear doesn't make me a bad guardian. It makes me a good one, because I know exactly how precious they are, and I know exactly how much I have to lose, and I choose to love them anyway." He paused, his voice rougher. "You lost people too, Margaret. Your son, your husband. I know that pain, but you're using your pain as a weapon against other people's happiness. These girls aren't replacements for Sarah. They're themselves, Clara and Elise, with their own lives and their own futures. And I'm honored to be part of those futures, if the court allows it." Margaret was crying now, angry tears that she tried to wipe away discreetly. When she spoke, her voice was thick. "How dare you compare your situation to mine? You don't know what I've been through." "You're right, I don't. But I know what those girls have been through, and I know they deserve better than being used as pawns in someone else's grief." Judge Pierce rapped his gavel. "That's enough. Mrs. Whitmore, you may step down. Is there anyone else who wishes to testify?" Bill Crawford stood. "I'd like to say something, Your Honor." "Proceed." Crawford walked to the front, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I've known Thomas Hale for 15 years. He's a good man who went through hell and came out the other side harder and lonelier than he should have been. When those girls showed up, he could have turned them away. Nobody would have blamed him. But he didn't. He took them in, and he's done right by them. And frankly, I think this whole proceeding is a waste of time. Those girls are thriving. Anyone with eyes can see it. Let them stay with the man who saved their lives." One by one, others stood. Mrs. Hutchins, admitting her own failures and praising Thomas's success. Several ranch families who'd seen the girls in town and noticed the change in them. Even some of Margaret's own supporters shifted uncomfortably, clearly questioning whether they'd chosen the right side. Finally, Judge Pierce held up his hand. "I've heard enough. I'm going to take a short recess to consider my decision." The wait was agony. Thomas sat with the girls and Eleanor, none of them speaking, all of them trapped in their own fears and hopes. Clara held his hand so tightly he lost feeling in his fingers, but he didn't pull away. When Judge Pierce returned, his expression was unreadable. "I've considered all the testimony, reviewed all the documentation, and observed these children firsthand. This is my decision. I am granting Thomas Hale full legal guardianship of Clara and Elise Brennan, effective immediately, with the condition that Mrs. Eleanor Brooks remain in the household for a minimum of 1 additional year to provide continued supervision and support." The courtroom erupted. Thomas heard the words but couldn't quite process them. Guardianship. Granted. The girls were his. Clara was crying and laughing at the same time, and Elise had thrown her arms around his neck, and Eleanor was wiping her eyes and trying to maintain some dignity. Judge Pierce wasn't finished. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your concerns come from a place of genuine belief. But belief without evidence is just prejudice. These girls are demonstrably better off with Mr. Hale than they would be in any alternative placement. I suggest you redirect your considerable energy toward helping other children who actually need intervention, rather than trying to fix situations that aren't broken." Margaret stood and walked out without a word, her supporters trailing after her. The judge looked at Thomas. "Mr. Hale, you've taken on a significant responsibility. These girls will need support as they grow, education, medical care, guidance through adolescence. Are you prepared for that?" Thomas looked at Clara and Elise, at these two souls who'd wandered into his life and changed everything. "Yes, Your Honor, I'm prepared." "Then this court finds in your favor. Guardianship papers will be filed with the territorial office. Congratulations." The gavel came down with a finality that felt like freedom. Outside the courthouse, people clustered around them offering congratulations and support. Thomas accepted them with awkward nods, still processing what had happened. The girls were his. Legally, officially, permanently his. Eleanor shooed away the well-wishers eventually. Give them some space, they need a moment. On the ride home, nobody spoke much. The girls sat in the back of the wagon, holding hands, occasionally breaking into smiles that they tried to hide. Eleanor sat next to Thomas, her own expression satisfied. "You did well in there," she said quietly. "I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do." When they reached the ranch, Thomas helped everyone down from the wagon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the house looked warm and welcoming in the fading light. "Mr. Hale," Clara said, "you can call me Thomas now if you want." She smiled. "Thomas, thank you for everything, for not giving up on us. Thank you for not giving up on me." That night, after supper, Thomas went out to his workshop, a small building near the barn where he kept tools and worked on projects during the long winter months. He'd been working on something for weeks, carving carefully, taking his time to get it right. Now he brought it inside. A small wooden piece, intricately carved, showing 2 pairs of boots side by side, one slightly larger than the other, both worn but sturdy. "What's that?" Elise asked. "A reminder," Thomas said. He hung it above the hearth in the place of honor. "Of the night 2 girls walked into my life and reminded me what home means." Clara studied the carving, then looked at him with those wise, too old eyes. "You saved us." "No," Thomas said. "We saved each other." And in that moment, standing in the warmth of the house they'd built together, not from wood and nails, but from trust and choice and stubborn determination, Thomas finally understood what Eleanor had been trying to tell him all along. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you. It meant opening yourself to new love, even knowing the risk of loss. It meant choosing life over safety, connection over isolation, hope over despair. Sarah would always be part of him. Elizabeth, too. The pain of those losses would never fully disappear. But alongside that pain now lived something else. The joy of Clara's quick mind and fierce protectiveness, the sweetness of Elise's gentle nature and growing confidence, the unexpected friendship with Eleanor who'd upended her own life to help them all. The girls weren't replacements for what he'd lost. They were additions to who he was becoming, a man who'd been broken and had allowed himself to be put back together, not perfectly, but well enough to matter. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall. The garden flourished under Eleanor's care and the girls' attention. Clara started teaching Elise arithmetic along with letters, and both girls grew stronger and healthier with each passing month. Thomas taught them to ride, to rope, to handle the basics of ranch work. Eleanor taught them to sew and preserve food and manage a household. They became a unit, the four of them, not conventional, not what any of them had planned, but real and solid, and theirs. One evening in late autumn, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Thomas stood on the porch watching the girls play in the yard. They were building a snowman, laughing and arguing about where the arms should go, completely absorbed in their task. Eleanor joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "They're good girls." "They are. You're a good father to them." Thomas looked at her in surprise. "Father? What else would you call it? You feed them, clothe them, teach them, worry about them, love them. That's what fathers do." Father. The word felt too big, too presumptuous, but it also felt right in a way that made his chest tight. "I never thought I'd have another chance," he admitted. "Life has a way of giving us what we need when we're finally ready to accept it." The girls called to them, wanting help with the snowman. Thomas and Eleanor walked down the steps together, and for the next hour they all worked on creating the most ridiculous snowman Montana had ever seen, lopsided and crooked and perfect. That night, after the girls were asleep and Eleanor had retired to her corner, Thomas sat by the fire and thought about everything that had changed since that winter night, when two half-frozen children had crawled into his barn seeking shelter. He told them they were already home, never imagining how true those words would become. They hadn't just found a home with him. They'd created one, all of them together, building something new from the broken pieces of what they'd lost. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in white. But inside, the fire burned warm. The house was full of the quiet sounds of people sleeping safely, and Thomas Hale, who'd once thought his life was over, finally understood that it had actually just been waiting to begin. The girls were home. Eleanor was home. And for the first time in 5 years, so was he.